Hello and welcome to yet another Think Design Works Smart video. I'm Alex Bolboaca. I'm coming to you from the Mozaic Works studios, and what we have for you today is our first live on YouTube. Actually, we've done a lot of live events online, but on Crowdcast and other platforms. So this is our first time using YouTube for a live transmission. And joining me today is Adi. Hi, Adi.
Hello.
Right. So the main topic for today is about learning techniques for software developers, and the reason for this is that I published a series of videos with me learning a new technology, htmx. But I think I showed in those videos a number of techniques that I use for learning a new technology. And so what I hope is to have a conversation about these techniques, and if anybody has any comments or questions, if anybody joins, we'll see, then we can also answer some questions. But before we do that, it's been a while since we've been on this channel. I had COVID in the summer, and then a bunch of other issues, and so we ended up publishing a lot of pre-recorded videos. The series with Alex Learns htmx was pre-recorded, and I published it. So it might be good to catch up a little. What have you been doing?
Coaching and technical coaching, a lot of work to do, making sure that there are quite a few teams I'm working with, that they start being more independent, and they can work more towards having, let's say, a real XP agile, how you want to call it, team. There are a lot of topics, from product ownership to T-shape teams, and continuous learning, user story mapping, user story refinement, architecture, enterprise architecture. So all these topics are around in what I'm doing, and it's about shaping the environment for these teams so they can be very efficient and they can deliver quality and business value.
All right. Cool. So you have a direct experience with people who need to learn new things.
Yes.
And this will be a good start from our conversation. What have I been doing? Well, I'm in the middle of a migration. We are migrating some of our internal systems to other tools. And that is always an interesting challenge, because you know when you start, it's very hard to predict when you will end. But it's a good thing, I think, for us to migrate. I've also had very interesting training with on native cloud architecture, but with DevOps people. This was quite unexpected to me. We have this course that I've built on native cloud architecture, and it treats a lot of the patterns and things that you might do when it comes to cloud, not only AWS, also Azure, Google Cloud, so the general idea of cloud architecture. But it's been very interesting to me to see the focus of DevOps professionals. And I actually wrote a few tweets about it, but I like to share a few quick things. It's interesting to see that they are very knowledgeable in terms of infrastructure, and for them, for example, it's much simpler to have a single database than multiple databases, like we say, with domain-driven design and microservices and so on. On another hand, they know very well the costs of infrastructure, and they can figure out things related to costs, but the costs of introducing bugs are very transparent. We had a lot of interesting conversations around this topic, that there's a possibility that somebody will introduce a bug, and if you have a single database, that will influence everything else, and you might end up with a bunch of issues. So even though it seems that you are spending less on infrastructure and you are having less complexity with operational costs and so on the other hand, you might be introducing the risk of a high cost of bug fixes and incidents being introduced. And yeah, these were like two main things that were very interesting in our conversation. All right. So let's go to our main topic, shall we? Just a quick recap. So I've recorded these videos. Alex learns htmx. htmx is a technology that allows you to write. Basically, you have additional attributes on HTML, and they serve, instead of writing JavaScript, instead of writing AJAX calls, they serve. So just through those attributes, you can define what goes to the server, what is refreshed when the response comes from the server, and so on. So it's a very interesting technology because, to be honest, and I've said this before, I find that the JavaScript, the current state of JavaScript is a mess. It's a lot of complexity there with React and all these things. So I was looking for something simpler to develop some of our internal tools, but also, you want something simpler to learn from time to time. And this is a very powerful tool. But the main reason I recorded the series was not necessarily to learn HTMX, but more to show learning techniques. And this is why today we're doing, let's say, a kind of retrospective of this series. Now, Adi has not seen this series, so that will be interesting. But he knows and he's learned a lot of technologies himself, so we can definitely have some interesting conversations here. So let's start with you. Let's say you want to learn a new technology, something like this. Where would you start?
So in fact, I would pair. So that's my thing. I think almost 2 years back, I had this. I had a bit of time, and I wanted to play a bit with mobile development, and that's why I learned a few technologies on that. So how I did that was trying it out myself, and also finding a partner to pair with through my online remote pairing. On my blog post, I found Harald, who was my partner for, 6 months or so. So we paired a lot on this. We had a pet project, something about finding tracks in the mountain. So trying to see how they are, and anyway. We went through the technology and made a few screens and made deployments on our mobiles and so on, and it was really fun. So my approach would be to do something that has some value, try to pair with someone, try to do things myself as well. Take some time, a few hours now, a few hours then, but not very big periods of time in between, because you forget what you did. So you need to have maybe a few hours per day or every couple of days to do this. Read the documents, read the documentation, of course, but try it out yourself. I think this is the best approach to learn something.
All right, and I'm actually taking notes. Maybe you can also switch to the scene where everybody can see the notes. You also said something about so a pet project, pair programming, with remote programming, working great. Yeah, I wanted to add something else, I forgot, but we'll get to it. So what I did was I found that recording is a good incentive for me.
Yeah.
Because if I have a schedule for recording these episodes, and it took me about, okay, so each episode is about an hour, but actually the whole thing per episode took maybe 1.5 hours, something like that. It takes a bit longer because I also cut a bunch of things that were extra from some of the episodes, and I also took some breaks during that are not visible in the episode, but it was needed. So, but I agree with you. So I started with a very simple project. In this case, it was a to-do list. It's something that is extremely simple to do, and I've done this before in many other technologies. But I've also, and then I started with a very small working sample. A small working sample. In my case, this was it was one of the examples from their website, slightly modified, so that I could show this working. And this was my first thing. And then my next step was to set up tests. Did you use tests for?
Not that much. It's so because what we did wasn't that, it was some code, but it wasn't a lot of logic. We were doing more of UI screens, mobile, and that's why we didn't have a lot of tests. And we were also learning. So I think you can learn with tests when you need to learn a library or something that has logic, and it's really useful. Write tests towards that library or whatever framework it is. With UI, it's not that useful because you need to understand what is possible. And because it was a new framework, very new, very different than what both of us were used to in terms of setting it up and parameterizing it, configuring things. That's why tests wouldn't help.
Mm-hmm. Right. In my case, I found that tests were actually very useful. I wrote Selenium tests, at least in the beginning. I think in the latest version, I also have unit tests. But I started with Selenium tests because I know the functionality for a to-do list, right? I need to have a list, and then I need to be able to add to the list. I need to be able to edit. It's all pretty standard. It's quite easy. And this is where doing a problem that you already know and you've already done in other programming languages is very helpful, because you can start with the knowledge of the problem domain and then implement starting from here. But I agree, if you are only testing things like UI and so on, it doesn't make a lot of sense to do that. One thing that I find very useful with test-driven development is that test-driven development actually maps very closely with a learning process. Right? Oh, and what I mean by this, when I was writing a test, so focusing on the problem, I knew exactly what I wanted from that problem, but I didn't quite know how this will be implemented. So sometimes the details of the tests were not that clear, right? And so I would go on and write a sample, figure out how to make that thing in HTML, how I would like it to see, and then write the test, see the test fail, and then you can focus on the other side, on the solution, and figure, okay, what do I need to write as htmx attributes? What do I need to write on the server side so this will work, and so on. And I've always found this very interesting, that TDD maps with the learning process, because it goes in iterations and you learn more and more and more every iteration, but you're starting on a solid ground. You know that what you've done until then, it works. This is very useful, right?
Mm.
And then, of course, sometimes I would hit a problem. I had no idea how to solve something. And there are a few times during the episode when I say, okay, I'm going now into experimentation mode. And to me, experimentation mode means that I'm switching the way I'm thinking. I'm not looking to make tests pass or things like this. I'm not looking to have the functionality working. I make sure that I have everything committed. I start to make some changes, see how things work. And once I figure out how things work, I can either go back to the last solid state or change the tests and everything to fit the solution. Have you seen this?
Yes, sure. Sure. It makes sense, but it's not very widespread, let's say. I don't know many people who do that.
Yeah, I think I've learned it through pairing, actually.
Yes.
But it is one thing that I find very useful is to be very clear in what mode you are, right?
Mm-hmm.
Am I in the problem definition mode where I write the tests? Am I in the solution mode where I know the solution, I'm trying to implement it, I'm making things work? Or am I in a mode where I have no idea how to do that, and then I start experimenting, reading documentation, whatever, until I figure that thing out? And these are different mindsets, and I think you need to train each of those in turn.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's difficult to understand where you are during this. I know. Well, typically, I'm trying to make teams aware of the difference between understanding a problem and choosing from solutions. So that's why I think this is difficult. I saw this is difficult for many people. Experimentation is even more difficult. That means that you need to have very open mind and, just try things out. And then question is what to try.
Yeah. And I think here the key is to have a very good a very good goal, a very clear goal, and a small goal, because and I think this is where tests have helped me a lot, because I was writing a test, so I know the problem. Let's say I want to edit an item from the list and I have no idea how to do that. I say, okay, I'm going into experimentation mode. I start to read things. I write some code. I'm trying to make that work. I see that it works. But I have a very clear goal. If I start experimenting in general, for everything, then of course, I have no idea when this will end.
Mm.
Okay.
Yeah, anyway, there are other modes as well. So a very interesting thing that also for learning that we experimented for pairing was to say, look, even if we pair, there might be things that are very simple to do. And then we would do, you would stay because we're doing remote pairing. So we would stay in the call and do separate things for 15, 20 minutes, and then come back and say, I've done this, you've done that. Because if it's very simple, it doesn't make sense to work together as a pair. And it starts being boring or not that interesting and so on. So when you have tasks that you can do, like configurations or, like, I don't know, create a Git repository. I don't need to watch someone create a Git repository. It's kind of simple. I can do something in parallel. So what can I do so that we move faster? So this is interesting as well to understand through pairing how you can parallelize work when it's good and when it's good to work together when you have complexity and when you can optimize for learning or for a smaller number of defects or for better quality.
Yeah, that's a good point. If you are doing learning in a pair or even in a larger group like a dojo or mob or something like this, it doesn't mean that everybody has to be all the time doing the same thing.
Yes. This is the outside view, but I think it's not that effective.
Yeah. All right. So I'm having, unfortunately, my laptop just froze. We'll have to switch the scene a bit and then I'll restart and come back with the nice image. I have a new laptop, and it runs Ubuntu, but unfortunately it has a bug in the kernel. So that is pretty funny. Otherwise, I'm very happy with it, but it freezes from time to time, and yeah, not that cool. All right. So this is, let's maybe go back to something that's important. All software development is actually learning.
Yes, that's why we talk about learning techniques, because we always learn.
And not only because you are learning a new technology, this is one example, but you're always learning something new about the product, about your users, about your technology, about new technologies, about all kind of things. So some of the techniques that you mentioned in the beginning that you are using in coaching are also learning techniques, like user story mapping and
yes, because you're learning the product, you're learning the team, you're learning how to collaborate, you're learning about business analysis or system analysis, and so on.
And I have to say that a few years back, somebody asked me, a junior developer asked me, okay, so what should I learn so that I don't need to learn anything new ever in my career? And I was like, you're in the wrong business.
Yeah.
You're in the wrong craft. It's impossible to do that. You will always have something new to learn. All right, so we talked about experimentation mode. We talked about, my laptop is back up, by the way, so that's good. A small goal for each iteration. I would like to add something like I wrote here, embrace surprises. When you learn something new, something will surprise you. It's,
of course,
that's the nature of the beast, right? It's something new, so surprises happen. And I love when this happens. But sometimes you are trying to solve something and you are surprised by finding out that it doesn't work as you would expect. And that's when it can become a bit annoying, right? But it is what it is. That's what that's the process. You cannot avoid surprises when you're learning something new. And so it's good to embrace them, even if it means that you need to read some more documentation or do some more experiments and so on. What were your surprises with the technology for mobile?
We used Flutter. So Flutter is, I don't know, relatively new, let's say, compared to the others that exist. Oh, many surprises. Almost everything was a surprise, from how you configure it, how you put a drop-down list in the screen, how deploy it, how you write the code, where you write the code. So it wasn't, because I wasn't used to many of these areas, not doing mobile development. So that's why probably there were many surprises, and almost everything was a surprise. But after a while, you started understanding the logic behind it, and yeah, we started having less and less of these surprises. But still, it was quite, with every feature, everything that we added, it was always something new.
Yeah, I think in my case, one of the nice things about htmx is that it surprised me in very good ways. Usually with things that were much easier to do, like you would write another attribute and you would... So here's one example. Let's say you want to post all the values of hidden fields from a div, right? You can do that with two attributes in htmx. It is very, very simple, very, very powerful. Because you add on the div, you add a few attributes that say, okay, so I need you to... The trigger for the action is, I don't know, when you click something, and the action is to post, and the values that you are sending are selected by this CSS query or something like that. And then you can send all the values back. And this actually enabled, in my case, a pattern that I found that I also think is it's quite useless, but it was very interesting. Basically, it's the state monad applied to client server and to web applications. What does this mean? I have no state saved on server. The state is actually in the browser. And on every request, you send all the state, and you send... and you basically define what action you want to happen on the state, and you get a modified state. And this is, as I say, it's quite useless, I think. I thought about practical applications. I don't see a lot of those because once you close the browser, then the whole state goes away. You know, but it was very, very funny to try it out and to work with it and to see how to basically test the limits of the technology. And let me add this actually. Unfortunately, doesn't seem to work. I think it froze again. So one technique that I found and that I've done a lot of time is to test the limits of the technology that you're using.
Yes, of course. Kind of stress tests, but for the technology.
Yeah, in the sense that I'm looking at the problem and I'm thinking, okay, so how could I solve this, but in ways that are unexpected? And then I start writing the code based on that, and we see what happens. And this allows me to figure out how, what the limits are for the technology.
Mm-hmm.
And in this case, htmx, I have to say, pretty good. It has some very, very cool features. It's really, really interesting. Okay, my laptop is not helping a lot, but have you tested the limits of Flutter when you were learning?
No, we didn't reach that point. So no, but it would have been a point a bit later, probably, but we stopped. So not yet. We were just trying to figure out how to do things. But with other technologies, yes, for sure. I'm always trying to see how you can do things, and where something that isn't that nice or it's not that helpful to use certain features in certain conditions. You can go to, I don't know, let's say testing frameworks like JUnit or JBehave or Cucumber, or you try to use these RSpec and so on, and you start using them in one way or another, and you start seeing the limitations of each one of them. And it's good because after a while you start understanding how to use one, where it's best to use one and where it's best to use another one. Or the same with, I don't know, mocking frameworks, like you use Mockito, or if you want to use, I don't know, something for other, like JavaScript and so on. So you start trying to use more tools in the same area and see which one is best in which conditions. I think this is really useful and helpful to do before using it in production code.
Yeah.
Start seeing them in a lab environment, and otherwise it would be too late to take a bad decision and choose something that will make your life bad for a long time.
Yeah, and I think what happens here, another thing for me, why I use TDD when I'm learning, is that I'm learning technologies for the reason to use them in production at some point, right? And it helps me a lot if I can figure out what's the good testing strategy for that technology.
Mm-hmm.
while I'm learning. This is another thing that is very helpful with TDD. Because I'm thinking of production, I know I'll write tests for production code, but having a structure that I can set up incrementally while I'm learning is really good. And this is one thing that I rarely see in technologies, unfortunately, in their documentation. They don't spend enough, they don't have enough space in documentation for testing and how to test these applications, what kind of strategy to use.
Almost never, I would say.
Yeah. So you need to figure that out by yourself, unfortunately. I added here one thing that I've done, and I know I'm doing it, but I'm not sure it's the best idea, like learning multiple things at the same time. Because even though the series is called Alex Learns htmx, I've learned how to write Selenium tests in Python, and I've learned how to write templates in Jinja 2, and I've learned how to write, well, I knew how to write Flask code. Flask is the backend, Python backend that you can use for, because htmx is on the front end, you can use anything you want in the backend, but I wanted something with Python, and so I picked Flask. I knew how to use Flask, I knew how to use something, Python, but there were things that I've learned at the same time. And I'm actually not sure if this is such a good idea.
Yeah, I wouldn't do that, but...
On the other hand, I tend to go and look and say, oh, something else interesting. Let's try that out.
Yeah. Maybe that's why it's not a good idea.
Or I have this problem. Well, in this case, at least, it was focused on specific problems. So I wanted to test the code. Why introduce another programming language? Let's write Selenium tests in Python. It makes sense. But I've never done that before, so then I wrote Selenium tests before, but in other programming languages, so...
Yeah, it's too much. You're going too wide. It's very dangerous to do that.
And then with Jinja, it was a bit easier because I already had some templates. I had some duplication on the server side. Imagine that. And so I needed some kind of templating system. Now, I could have used the Python templating system that is already there in the language. But I said, okay, let's try Jinja 2. And in this case, it was quite quick and easy. But I can see situations where it might end up, doing days and days of work to figure things out. So maybe avoid doing that, right? All right. I think another thing that I've learned is to try to figure out the simplest solution.
Yeah, that's always impossible to figure out the simplest solution, but it's always important to try it.
Yeah.
And almost never the simplest solution is the first one that comes to your mind.
Maybe I should rephrase this, because if I think about this, actually what I did was first make it work.
Yes.
Then simplify it.
That's an approach that might get you to the simplest solution, but not always. But it can get you to simple enough, right? And quite often this is you don't need to do more than that.
Yeah. I think, one other thing that might be interesting here is, okay, related with TDD. is focus very, how would you say, narrowly on the current phase of the TDD cycle.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean here is, okay, so I'm always getting tempted when I'm doing test-driven development. When I'm writing the tests, I'm already tempted to refactor, for example.
Mm-hmm.
I think you've seen that, you felt that.
Mm-hmm.
But I try to resist that and just say, okay, so what's the simplest thing that I could write as the next test? What's the simplest thing that I could implement?
Yes.
What is the focus of my refactoring now? Can I live with this duplication for another 2-3 cycles? Can I live with this design for another, 2 hours or so?
Mm. Yeah. I try to live more with the design like that and really have enough proof. If you are very focused on cleaning things up, it's hard. The downside might be that you're never cleaning it up. So, yeah, there needs to be a balance here. And I think each one of us can find it.
In my case, I find the balance. So I look at the code and I say, okay, I can live with this. Or in other situations, I think I want to make this code better, but I have no idea how yet. So let's defer it a bit more until I can figure out how to. And it was very interesting in this series that by the end of the series, I actually have very simple tests that are parameterized, these data-driven tests. So you basically have a test with a bunch of annotations, but the test code is very small, and the code has become quite small because most of it has moved into templates and things like that. It's interesting to see the process, so how it goes from very silly things, like the first thing I've done, I already had a list with a bunch of items because you could add items. And then I'm thinking, okay, let's edit item. I have no idea and no way to implement to edit a specific item because I didn't have IDs for all those things. So there was no way of targeting one item. So the first test is, okay, let's edit first item. And I think for about 2 hours or 2 episodes, you can only edit the first item from the from the list. But then once I get into slowly, incrementally figuring out how to make this work, then I turn the code, I change the code, and you can now edit every item. And this becomes a very simple change in the end. But you have to go through these silly steps sometimes to get to the, to a good solution, right?
Yeah, it's true.
Okay, we have a question actually. Hi, Andres. Thank you for your question. How about practicing X days later the same thing in order to memorize structures?
Well, if that's your purpose, yeah, sure. I mean, repetition is a mother of learning. And from my experience, 3 times is a charm.
Mm-hmm.
So I would practice X days later, same thing, but once again. So once repeat and repeat even once more. it's important when you want to memorize things, when you want to understand. Yeah, I need to go back to psychology for for a minute.
Sure.
Because when you your brain needs to have the space to memorize things like that. So when you do things like exploring, you can be tired, and sometimes it's good to be tired, because typically all of us have a certain urge to stay to the things that we already know. So exploring means that we go out of the comfort zone, and if we're a bit tired, we don't have that much energy to oppose the new things that come. So it's a good idea when you are tired to explore. It's a good idea when you want to memorize things or try out things like that, to be to make sure that you are not tired, because in this way you will learn a lot better and a lot faster. Even more, what I learned from psychology, well, it's more about how the brain works, is that if you do something like this and then you take a nap, your brain will record things a lot faster. So make sure that also after you want to memorize something, you don't go to a party up to 5 in the morning, because probably you won't remember it so well. So to summarize, try to repeat it 3 times, and maybe different exercises, and make sure that you are rested, and you will rest after that. You will see that it's amazing, and it's a lot better like that.
Yeah, and I'm thinking what would happen if I would go back now and rewrite the same thing with what I know now.
Mm-hmm.
My guess is that it wouldn't take much shorter time, because anyway, it went pretty fast, I think. But maybe like a 20% reduction in time, something like that. I wouldn't expect a lot more. But I think it would be interesting indeed to memorize the sequences and the patterns and what's happening there. We have coding katas for this.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Exactly.
And you can make your own coding kata. I was just thinking now when you were speaking, one thing that you can actually do is to start to go back to a previous commit and do again the same changes.
Yeah, sure. You can do that very well, and I think it helps. The idea would be to try to have a commit where you have something stable, right? So not any commit. So when you have something where it's clear what you need to do, what you have done so far, and what you need to do from there on.
Yeah.
So that's important.
And this is where TDD helps. If you have all the tests are passing, you can basically go back to any point where you have all the tests passing and a clear goal for the next step.
Mm-hmm.
But you can even vary a bit. I mean, another thing that might be even more interesting, I think, is to go back to one stable commit, but then try to implement something completely different and see how that ends up in your code.
Yeah, of course. It's more like backtracking, right? Trying to do this, but with commits and features.
Yeah.
I think that anytime I would do something again, it will. At least my feeling is, but you can also, how we feel as how efficient we are and how efficient we really are is really different. So our perception might be that the second time when we do something, we're a lot faster. but maybe it's not true. There's this going back to psychology. There's the state of flow, which means that it's obvious. The path where we are going, you're like on rails. You're going that direction, no obstacles, and then you look at the clock and say, when did the time pass? So this state of flow may feel to us that we are really effective. Probably we are, but it could be that we're not that much more effective than last time, or we weren't in a state of flow.
Yeah.
So the only way to do this is measure. So
yeah.
Look how much time it took.
This reminds me of what's his name? Gorman, I think.
Jason Gorman,
who made an experiment once. He solved the same problem using test-driven development and without test-driven development.
Mm-hmm.
And what he noticed is that, and I think it was like 2 weeks apart or something like that, so long enough that he had forgotten the problem and the solution. And his perception was, when not doing test-driven development, his perception was that he was going much faster.
Mm-hmm.
But when he actually measured, it turns out that no, he was a lot behind.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason for this is that when you are not doing test-driven development, a lot of things are going wrong, right? And you need to split your attention into a lot of directions and figure out, okay, so why is that not working? Why is that not working? And it feels like you're always advancing. But in reality, what you are doing is you're creating a lot of hurdles in your ahead of you, and you're just passing those hurdles instead of moving swiftly through the problem. That's quite an interesting. And of course, it's one person, it's anecdotal evidence. Try it for yourself, see how it goes. But I found it very interesting. Going back to flow and test-driven development and learning, another analogy that I'm often making is with games. So games are made to induce a state of flow. You often, when you play a video game or a board game, you often don't feel the time passing, right? It's like, now it's 1 p.m. and when did we get to 4 a.m. playing this? Something like that. And test-driven development is very similar with a game, in the sense that if you think about role-playing games, you do something, you gain experience, you level up, and then you do something else, you gain more experience, you level up, and so on. And this is in a way the mechanics of test-driven development as well. I am implementing something that works, and then implementing something else that works, and so on. And for me, this induces a state of flow.
Mm-hmm.
Much more than the way I used to develop software in the beginning of my career, which was write a bunch of code and then debug for 2 days.
Exactly, yeah. Well, it's important to know that when you have tests, it's really a good technique of making sure that you don't need to go back, right? Because you have covered everything. So I don't remember who said this, but the difference is like having a car with brakes or having a car without brakes. So why would you drive a car 130 kilometers per hour on a highway without brakes? You wouldn't, because it would be very dangerous. So that's the same idea. Coding really fast somewhere in an area where you don't have tests, you don't do that. you need to be very careful of every step and checking it again and again because you don't have brakes. So tests are your brakes, and you can use it. You can check, you can stop, you can check that what you've done was good. So maybe also that generates a state of flow. The fact that you have brakes, you can go faster, and that is that's the sense of flow, like you'd have driving on a highway.
Mm-hmm. All right. That's an interesting analogy. I've never heard it before, but it makes a lot of sense. All right, so we are getting close to the end of this. We have about 3 more minutes to stay live. If you have any more questions or comments, or or if you are interested in seeing other series on development, or on me continuing this series, it would be cool, to share some comments. Going back a bit to learning multiple things at the same time, I also learned about Vim while doing this. And I was using Vim, but on the other hand, I don't find that this part as bad, because you are always learning something new about your tools, right? It maps the real thing.
Yes.
And one more thing that I'd like to say about repeating. I think it's a good idea, as we said. Personally, I tend to get a bit bored quickly. And so for me, repeating a kata is not that great. I mean, I like doing the same kata but with different people.
Mm-hmm.
Or with the same people but trying different scenarios. It has to be some kind of variation. It has to be some kind of variation in the repetition for me to be interested in that. But that's a me problem. It's not a everybody problem. The good thing is, if you are like me and you are having this kind of problems, you can always try another pet project. Right. So
yes, exactly.
You don't have to use a kata and repeat the same things. So I've done this, let's say I've done this to-do list. Now another thing that I would find very interesting to do would be a Kanban board, which is similar with a to-do list, but not quite the same. I know precisely what I want to do there. Once again, I know the problem very well. I know the problem domain. So yeah, I'll definitely do something like that next, if I were to try another pet project.
Yeah, so have problems that are a bit more complicated, but still manageable.
Yeah, and I think where the key lies in knowing precisely the problem domain, right? Because if I were now to start developing a game completely from scratch using this technology and so on, that's a development project already. I have to figure out first what are the requirements and so on. So it takes a long time until you end up at the point where you can actually implement something. But if I'm using a problem that I'm very familiar with, and by the way, I'm actually implementing a game using htmx, but it's a game that we already test-driven, like played using Miro and so on. So I know the rules. It's not something completely new. Then at least you can jump straight into the implementation and not in figuring out what you need to do, because that takes a long time. And it can be annoying if you're trying to learn a new technology. So it goes back to learning, focus on a clear goal. And my clear goal was learn htmx, at least for this series. All right. So I think we are close to the end. I don't see any more questions or comments. Thank you so much for joining us live. This was our first live. Before we close, Adi, anything else you'd like to add?
I'd like to end with a quote that I really like from Chris Matz. And he said, Agile is a learning machine.
Mm-hmm.
So if you are in a team, you can scratch Agile, it doesn't matter. When you are in a team, consider your team being a learning machine. Think how much you can learn, how much you need to learn, and optimize your learning, because your work will be much nicer. Your products will be of a lot better quality, and you won't have headaches. Quite the opposite. You have something to be very happy about. So that's why think about you and your team like a learning machine. Try to get the best out of it.
Right. So that's it from us. This was our first YouTube live, and it all worked really well, I think. We still have some small things to fix, but thank you so much for joining us for this live. If you have any more questions, post them in the comments. Well, I make a point of answering the comments at least once a week, so we'll make sure to answer whatever you have in you are asking, or suggest other topics for us. Would you like to see us for another live? Let us know. Thank you so much for watching. It's been great having you here, and until next time, remember to think, design, and work smart.